The Financial Sense Newshour with Jim Puplava continues, featuring uncommon news for the wise investor. Up next, commentary and debate about today's financial issues with the experts. Here's Jim Puplava.
Never has an administration taken office with more inflated expectations of turning Washington around. And never has a media-anointed American Idol and his entourage fallen so fast and hard. Joining me this week is Michelle Malkin. She's written a new book called Culture of Corruption. And Michelle, with the Obama victory, we'd seen something we had never seen in this country. It was the first time we had seen a black man elected to the presidency. The media was just overwhelmed by, let's say, if you take a look at the star power, the brain trust that was behind our new elected president. But underneath the surface, there was an elite group of power brokers instead of a team that looks like America, as some describe. It was business as usual. Why is that?
Well, that's what paved the path to power for Barack Obama. He paid lip service to hope and change and bringing a new style of politics to Washington, but that is not how he got to where he was. And so what this book did was show you comprehensively, connect the dots, follow the money, and talk about the influence peddlers, the back scratchers, and the Beltway swamp creatures who buoyed Barack Obama. And I think one of the characters that really is the epitome of what Barack Obama is all about is Tom Daschle. And most folks thought that we got rid of Tom Daschle at the beginning of this year when his nomination to head the Department of Health and Human Services was torpedoed because of his massive tax violations. This is a man who had hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes owed on a crony driver that was lent to him by a campaign contributor when he was the Senate Minority Leader. And there were a number of ethics and pay-for-play scandals that embroiled Tom Daschle towards the end of his Senate career and ultimately torpedoed him in his last run for Senate, which he lost to John Kyle, in large part over tax and ethics scandals. Unfortunately, although he was publicly thrown under the bus, Tom Daschle never left. And to me, this is so representative of how Barack Obama does business, because again, he'll pay lip service to cleaning house, and yet Tom Daschle has been behind the scenes for the last 8 or 9 months helping to craft the Obamacare government health care takeover, shepherd it through Congress, and now salvage it in the wake of a massive public backlash over the plan.
You know, something that I thought was kind of strange is early on in the vetting process, there were a number of candidates that were eliminated, Daschle being one of them, over issues of either one, not paying taxes, fraud. Some dropped out from the list, but quite a few made it into the cabinet post, and past indiscretions were sort of overlooked. How is that possible?
Well, I put my finger on what I think is one of the main problems and one of the main boons for Team Obama through the campaign years and over the last 8 months of his tenure, and that is the enabling factor of the mainstream media, much of which openly cheerleaded his campaign and in many ways was almost literally in the tank for him. There are, I half-jokingly say this, there are as many former journalists now officially working for the Obama administration as there are czars.
You know, it seems to me, too, there's a media war going on, let's say, between Fox News, who's covering some of these issues, and then even between some of the stars on the show, whether it's a Glenn Beck or a Keith Olbermann on another program. What has happened to the media in the sense that if you take a look at the Acorn scandal, that was broke by Fox. There was, trying to think of the gentleman that had to resign because of his background. There's almost like a war going on between the media over this very issue.
Well, it's a war that's provoked by mainstream journalists that refuse to do their jobs and then turn around and accuse anyone who actually does the job of journalism of being some sort of anti-Obama partisan. And what you've seen is watchdogs turn to alternative sources like Fox News, the Internet, conservative talk radio, alternative talk radio, because these mainstream outlets do not want to jeopardize the career of their favored candidate and president. And I'm not just theorizing about this. In the chapter on Acorn and Culture of Corruption, I talk about a former liberal member and worker for Acorn and Project Vote named Anita Moncrief, who had served quite regularly as a whistleblower for the New York Times. And she gave information to a reporter there, Stephanie Strom, who was on the case of financial shenanigans at Acorn. All the stuff that we're now hearing about, the New York Times knew about before the election. But they cut bait, quote unquote, that is an exact phrase from an editor at the New York Times, 2 weeks before the election. Now, why do you think that is? I don't think in the age of Obama that there are such things as coincidences when we come to matters like this. And I've quoted copiously from leaked documents, email exchanges between this whistleblower, Anita Moncrief, and this reporter, Stephanie Strom of the New York Times, who acknowledged the scandal involving myriad entities of Acorn, its flagship national office, which is technically able to engage in partisan political activity, and then all of its hundreds of affiliates, which are supposedly nonpartisan, non-profit, and tax-exempt, shuffling money between and among these organizations and evading both tax laws and campaign finance laws. This is what Congress is now investigating, but it's not news.
You know, the one thing that Obama promised when he came to office and was that there was going to be a new transparency, but it appears almost hostile to the transparency issue. And what I want to bring up is the current health care bill in the Senate, where there's a gag rule. It's my understanding the senators aren't even going to be given details, and the public is not going to be allowed to, let's say, see the bill in advance, as we did with, let's say, H.R. 3200. As more people looked into the details, it triggered all the protests that you saw at the town hall meetings. So what happened to the 72-hour notice in the campaign? These bills were going to be put on the website so people could view and see the legislation, how it impacted them. That doesn't sound like what's happening in the Senate right now.
Well, again, I half joke that Obama lied and transparency died. It was one of his foremost campaign pledges. He made a big deal out of it in the first days and weeks of his young administration, and yet, within a matter of weeks, had broken all of those high-minded pledges to be as open as possible and to turn the clock back on the supposedly secretive years of the Bush era. And that hostility to transparency is no surprise if you watched from the very beginning the kind of people that Barack Obama surrounded himself with. I mean, you start with Hillary Clinton, who for years fought disclosure of massive donations from foreign governments and corporations who filled Bill Clinton's library and foundation coffers. I also point in my book to the number 2 official at HUD, Ron Sims, a former King County, Washington executive who had the notorious distinction of being the most fined government official in his state's history for suppressing public records from taxpayers. And then, of course, there's David Axelrod, his senior White House advisor, a mastermind campaign strategist from his Chicago days, who was behind all of his campaign victories, who is most famous for astroturfing. In other words, creating the illusion of grassroots support by hiding the true source of corporate contributions and corporate chilling. So all of that should have given you a taste of what we're seeing now. But with regard to the health care takeover, of course, he's got allies and cronies on Capitol Hill in the Democrat majority who are all too willing to help him subvert transparency. And I think it behooves taxpayers, voters, to keep a very close watch on how this whole process is unfolding. The Heritage Foundation has nicknamed the process the quote-unquote vapor bill. And it drives me nuts when you see on TV people talking about a bill. There is no bill. The Congressional Budget Office, when it announced its scoring, financial scoring of the so-called Balkus plan this week, actually didn't have anything to score. It's an estimate of a summary, as one Beltway analyst put it, because there is no legislative language yet to analyze.
Is this a new way of doing business? You pass a bill and fill in the details after it's passed?
Well, the scope and the chutzpah with which they're doing this, I think, is unprecedented. The Senate and the House have both long engaged in all sorts of gimmickry in the reconciliation process and attaching huge expansions of government as obscure amendments to larger vehicles and appropriations bills. But it really is, in this case, about measuring the Grand Canyon-sized gap between Barack Obama's rhetoric and this sordid reality.
The one thing that we saw immediately is we saw this in the recovery package, the $800 billion package, which had very little stimulus in it. It's not a surprise that we're seeing rising unemployment. But the other thing was the appointment of lobbyists. And then in the second bill, the supplemental spending bill, just a tremendous amount of earmarks, even as the president gave a speech about earmarks.
Yeah. Well, everything that this president pledges has an expiration date. And again, what strikes me is the chutzpah of declaring these massive pieces of legislation earmark-free when they're stuffed to the gills with it. And I think we saw early on, particularly with the stimulus, porculus, Generational Theft Act bill turned into law, that this was never going to be anything more than a Herculean slush fund and payoff for these lawmakers.
The one thing that we saw as well is the number of individuals that were proposed for a cabinet post that had issues dealing with taxes. How does one get away for such a long period of time of not paying taxes? Because I would suspect as individuals or even people that have businesses, if they did the same thing, sooner or later they would get an audit from the IRS, because you do have programs at the IRS that check things, things that look unusual, and they audit you. But how does one get away of, let's say, not paying taxes for a decade on certain things? Is it just there's too many taxpayers and they don't follow up?
Well, with regard to all of the tax cheats in the Obama administration, of course, the first prerequisite is having a D by your name. And it is quite remarkable, the number of Democrats, both in the White House and on Capitol Hill, and I'm thinking, of course, primarily of Charlie Rangel, who've been able to get away with tax evasions and failures to disclose that no ordinary citizen would ever be able to get away with. Of course, Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, rubs ordinary folks the wrong way the most, I think, particularly, and I think it bears repeating and reminding folks about, because of the nature of his tax indiscretion and the position that he's currently in overseeing the IRS, which enforces our tax laws. Remember that not only did he fail to pay taxes on an illegal alien worker, but he was also collecting tax rebates from his employer, the International Monetary Fund, and had signed forms pledging that in order to receive the tax rebate that he had paid the taxes. And it is that blatant flaunting of the rule of law and the fact that he's gotten away with it, and that in his position as Treasury Secretary he is now going after international tax cheats, that I think really helps shatter the myths of hope and change.
I want to move on. You have a chapter in the book on the president's wife and her involvement and connection to lobbyists.
Yeah, and I think more importantly, what I do is really give readers a sense of her political pedigree, her heritage as a literal heir of the Daley patronage system. Her father was a city water department worker in Chicago who had gotten his job as a result of being a Democratic precinct chair and loyal to the first Richard J. Daley. And then after Michelle Obama had flitted from Princeton to Harvard to Sidley and Austin, which is one of the most prestigious law firms in Chicago, took a job with Richard M. Daley, the boss's son, and met up with huge power brokers like Valerie Jarrett, who's now the senior White House advisor and most recently in the news for the failed Olympics bid, that entire fiasco. And Michelle Obama had then followed Valerie Jarrett to the University of Chicago Medical Center. Jarrett served on the board of directors, and Michelle got a very cushy job, six-figure salary as a vice president of external affairs and community relations. And there engaged in some pretty sketchy dealings with lobbyists in which she may have engaged in a pay-for-play scandal on a bid for a software contract, and then herself served on corporate boards of directors, including one that was a major distributor to Walmart at the same time that her husband was campaigning and demonizing Walmart. So, again, I think, I call her the first crony, and I think it's an appropriate label for someone who has risen primarily because of her Chicago crony connections, but then also I think as a symbol of that same do as I say, not as I do mentality that has infused the Obama administration.
Let's move on to Ordinary Joe, Vice President Biden, who's portrayed as kind of this common guy, grew up, I don't know if it was coal miner's son, and is just kind of like an ordinary guy, and he often boasts about he's one of the poorest members of the Senate, the least wealthy members. What's wrong with that image?
Well, it's completely anathema to the true Joe Biden, who was an entrenched 3-decade incumbent senior senator from Delaware and who traded quite easily and frequently on his name and his position to benefit himself and his family. Not that there's anything new about that, but of course, this is a man that the ultimate agent of hope and change chose to be his second in command. And what does that tell you? I go into great detail, and without giving too much away in the book, because I want there to be something left for your listeners to actually read, one of Joe Biden's great backers during his campaigns and while he was in office was MBNA, the huge financial credit interest that was based in Delaware for a long time before it was taken over. And they were a huge contributor to Joe Biden's campaign coffers and also hired his son Hunter as a lobbyist, again, at the same time that both Michelle and Barack Obama were on the campaign trail all throughout 2008, lobbying against the lobbying industry. And then Hunter Biden and his uncle James, Joe's brother, were involved in a very shady scandal that would have raised all sorts of eyebrows if they had been Republicans. They engaged in a strange and messy deal with a hedge fund company called Paradigm, which was up to its eyeballs in litigation and charges and countercharges of fraud, and was still in court at the time that Obama and Biden were out on the hustings. And yet you heard very little about this from the mainstream media.
I want to move on to the topic of czars in the Obama administration, and I think to be fair to the president, there were a large number of czars in the Bush administration, and the Bush administration accelerated the appointment of these czars that didn't have to get any congressional approval. So what makes Obama different than, let's say, George Bush?
Well, I talk in the book about how we've been plagued by this czar phenomenon in both Republican and Democrat administrations, and I've never liked it in either. I think that it's always been a way to circumvent congressional oversight. And one might argue that something like a Homeland Security czar under the second Bush administration was necessary because we didn't have a Department of Homeland Security yet, and we had real grave national security risks, and we needed somebody to coordinate between and among many different agencies. You might make that case. However, what marks the Obama administration is the vast number of these appointees in such a small amount of time, and the superfluousness of so many of these czars. It strikes me that we don't need a health care czar when we already have a confirmed Secretary of Health and Human Services. It strikes me that we don't need an energy czar when we already have a confirmed head of the EPA. It strikes me that we don't need an urban czar when we already have a confirmed Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And I have heard very few of the critics of this czar explosion articulate that exact point. Fortunately, there have been a rising number of critics, and it's not just an anti-Obama phenomenon. One of the first critics was Robert Byrd, the guardian of the Constitution, the Democrat from West Virginia, who I have very little in common with, but who was on to this very troubling development early on. Russ Feingold, another liberal Democrat with whom I share few positions on, recently held a hearing on the topic and was very disturbed by the White House's lack of responsiveness to his inquiries.
You know, one thing that we've seen in this administration, but also in fairness to in the last Bush administration, is a very strong relationship between the president and Wall Street. If you look at the number of individuals, for example, either an advisor, such as Rahm Emanuel, chief of staff, the number of people that are tied to the investment banking community, the number of individuals who have received special loans from financial institutions, and even, some of the carryover. Now, we saw some of this in the Bush administration. I mean, you take a look at Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury, former Goldman Sachs, in on the bailout of Lehman, making sure Goldman was taken care of. So we've seen it in both administrations. Is that a growing trend? In other words, financial power and political power are melded together, because certainly we've seen it in the Obama administration as well, and as previous administrations that preceded it, whether it was Bush or it was Clinton.
Yeah, I think it's a troubling phenomenon. You have this statist alliance between Washington and Wall Street, and it doesn't matter if a Democrat or a Republican is in office. And I was one of the most foremost critics of George W. Bush and Hank Henry Paulson for essentially pre-socializing the economy for Barack Obama and his team. And there's an incredible amount of overlap between and among the Goldman Sachs, or more accurately, government Sachs, lobbyists, city lobbyists that infested the Bush administration and in many cases were carried over into the Obama administration. You know, Obama promised that he was going to end the Bush years. But when it comes to this Wall Street-Washington alliance, it's more of the same old, same old. And the chapter in Culture of Corruption that I wrote on the Wall Street money men shows you that the architecture, the bailout architecture that was been put in place by Hank Paulson was embraced quite readily by Tim Geithner and many of the cronies that he brought in with him. I think this is a problem. And I think that the kind of connect-the-dots investigative reporting that many mainstream media outlets did under the Bush era needs to be done under the Obama administration as well, which is what drove me to write the book in the first place. There was a vacuum that needed to be filled, a void that was there. And, you know, a lot of the liberal critics of the book have nothing else to say and invoke but the moral equivalency card. Well, what about Bush? Where were you when Bush was in office? Well, I have two answers to that. And one is, again, you can read my record. Go on my website, michellemalkin.com, and you'll see copious posts complaining about that alliance. But second, of course, is the fact that I didn't need to write a book about Bush corruption because it was on the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post every day.
One thing that really surprised me, and this I think is an alarming trend, and that is the way the GM bankruptcy was handled. And I can remember the president going on the air and saying that those that opposed it were greedy hedge funds. But you're talking about the state of Indiana pension fund. You're talking about mutual fund investors. A lot of pensions, corporate pensions, government pensions were invested in GM bonds. And, you know, the law, or where the creditor is put to the top, was just basically rewritten and thrown out the door in favor of skewing the whole settlement to the unions.
Yeah, and these kind of payoffs to the unions are extremely troubling, given Barack Obama's alliance and allegiance and loyalty to big labor. Yep, we saw it with the GM bankruptcy. We see it with the appointment of the so-called manufacturing czar, Ron Bloom, who also happens to be holding the car czar position at the same time, a former United Steelworkers and AFL-CIO protege, of the last decade, who has spent his entire career shaking down corporations to pay off and bribe the union. I have a chapter in my book on the Service Employees International Union, and you see the same kind of thug tactics. And in fact, I have a very compelling quote from the president of the SEIU, Andy Stern, who explains his organizing philosophy, and it might as well be the organizing philosophy of the entire left, and certainly Barack Obama. And it is this: we prefer to use the power of persuasion, but when that doesn't work, we will use the persuasion of power. And that is not an empty or idle threat. That is how they do business.
I want to move on to Acorn. When, Fox broke the news about how they were supposedly trying to help this couple that wanted to start a brothel, avoid taxation. That made national headlines. That was broken. But also they were currently being investigated in numerous cases in states for voter fraud. Is this just something that will be a storm that passes by? They've threatened to cut off funding for Acorn, and there's supposedly an investigation, but will that be put back on the burner once the storm passes through?
Well, just a couple of things. They did cut off funding. Both the House and the Senate voted and approved funding bans in various appropriation bills, and there are now several Inspector General investigations among different agencies on their spending, whether it's the HUD or the EPA. I mean, pretty much every federal agency has given Acorn money. And just as background for, listeners who might need a refresher course, Acorn is a 3-decade-old welfare rights organization that has been turned into a nationwide army to elect and keep Democrats in perpetuity. I mean, it is nothing less than a satellite organization of the Democratic Party, and it has benefited mightily from federal funding. 40% of its funds come from taxpayers, you and me, and in essence, those of us who do believe in limited government and the free market have been funding our own political suicide by funding Acorn. I don't think it's going to just blow over, and while the stings, these Acorn sting videos, certainly ushered in this latest round of investigations, there have been many people who have been on the Acorn racketeering case for a long time, including myself. And the chapter that I wrote on Acorn is a very helpful overview that gives you the full scope of the activities that Acorn has been involved in. It's not just voter registration fraud. It's not just the fact that they hired homeless people and criminals to register Mickey Mouse and dead people to vote. That's the tip of the iceberg. Where they got most of their money is in targeting and shaking down financial institutions and banks by playing the race card to the most detrimental effect, and in essence helping perpetuate the subprime crisis with these kind of schemes. And that's the task for these congressional investigators, to get the full scope of that, really crack open the books. I mean, we're talking about a multi-million, if not billion-dollar operation that rivals any Fortune 500 company.
Michelle, since I've been following politics as an adult, we've seen scandals almost in every single administration. The Nixon administration with Watergate, you had Iran-Contra with Reagan. So isn't this almost part of the Washington culture that we see these scandals in every presidential administration? I mean, is Obama any different than any president that went before him?
Well, I think there are a couple of differences. And one is that there has never been a candidate in modern American history that has ridden into Washington on as high an ethics horse as Barack Obama has. He's the one that told us to measure him by both his words and his deeds, and that's exactly what I've done. And by that measure, he is remarkably more corrupt than other administrations we've seen in recent history, by his own measurement, by his own standards. And I think that the Tsar explosion and then his own intimate involvement in these corrupt organizations like Acorn, and the fact that he's gotten away with it, is extraordinary. He cut his teeth as a community organizer. He owed his political birth to a group like Acorn. He was a lawyer for Project Vote, which is one of the hugest affiliates for Acorn. And he has been directly involved in the kind of campaign finance law evasion that he had said he was going to work to stop. During the campaign, and I report this in the book, and it still needs much more probing than it's got, Team Obama funneled $800,000 to an Acorn affiliate with the name of Citizen Services, Inc. And mysteriously, they filed papers with the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, claiming that somehow this $800,000 expenditure had been a clerical error, was misclassified, and they just waved the magic wand and reclassified it from a hard money political expenditure to soft money, get out the vote. How did that happen? Why isn't anyone answering questions about that? Does anyone not care about electoral integrity anymore? You would think that there'd be good government types and honest progressives who would care.
Outside the fact that he proposed or promised that he would be different than the administration that preceded him, is there anything that Obama's done that really stands out that makes him any different than the other presidents, other than the fact that he promised a change, that, it was going to be different, he was going to be transparent, he was going to get rid of the lobbyists, et cetera, et cetera. But, the things that are being done within his cabinet and the type of people he surrounded himself and his own involvement, is he any different than other presidents, or is there one thing that stands out about him?
Well, I think you have to read the book in totality. And after you finish it, and by the way, the epilogue is a portrait of how Barack Obama has joined himself at the hip of one of the most corrupt senators in Washington, Chris Dodd. He's already endorsed him for re-election in Connecticut this next election cycle, despite Chris Dodd's incredible amount of lapses in judgment, ethical mismanagement, and scandals involving many of the demonized subprime lenders, including countrywide, that Barack Obama has gone after. And yet there's this wonderful portrait of the two of them supposedly representing hope and change now and in the future. And so I think it's strange to minimize this fact. And I think perhaps because we've had such a high level of tolerance for this Beltway cesspool, look at the reams of Democrats who are currently involved in scandals. And that's not to say that Republicans aren't involved in these scandals. I think they justly deserve the culture of corruption title that was slapped on to them by Nancy Pelosi and Howard Dean during the midterm elections in 2006. But does that exempt and absolve all of the Democrats who are currently mired in this? Do we just shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's always been like this, and hey, what's the difference? I don't think so. But I think that there are Republicans, Democrats, independents who all believed in Barack Obama's promises, who all hoped for something better, who all hoped for not just transparency, but a real commitment to deliberative democracy. They haven't got that. And when they raised their voices over the long, hot recess, the Tea Party movement, the town hall protests, what did they get in response? Utter contempt, mockery, derision, attacks from this White House. It's shameful.
The name of your book is called Culture of Corruption, and the thing that strikes me, is it a culture that lends itself and supports this kind of behavior in corruption? Because as you just mentioned, you see this in both sides, and one thing that really got me is the Wall Street Journal in August did a story, and you can remember, Michelle, the beginning of the year, how the congressman lashed out at these corporate CEOs for having private jets. And then Congress itself turns around and votes for a $550 million bill for Gulfstreams for congressmen. You've got John Boehner with 5 Republicans and their wives on a 3-week fact-finding mission in Europe. So it seems like every single administration, Republican Congress, Democrat Congress, Republican president, Democratic president, is it a culture that gives way to this and supports it, number one? And number two, if it is a culture, how does it get changed?
Well, at the end of Culture of Corruption, I make an observation about this, and that is the first and last law of political physics. As government grows, corruption flows. The problem is bigger and bigger government, because when you have massive new federal spending, plus tens of thousands of pages of new regulations, plus unprecedented new powers over taxpayers and the economy, what does that translate into? Well, it translates into limitless new opportunities for sleaze by Republican and Democrat lobbyists and influence peddlers. The favor trading, the deal cutting, the influence peddling, as I mentioned. And then the D and the R don't matter anymore. It's about the W, the Washington. That's why you can have someone like Tom Daschle and Bob Dole both working for the same law and lobbying firm on K Street, Alston and Byrd, both agreeing that somehow a government health care takeover is good for the country when what it's good for is their pockets and their clients.
Do you see any hope as you look at this? I mean, it seems like if we look at the current financial situation, I'm reminded of Rahm Emanuel saying, never let a crisis go wasted. And so we're seeing government expand. In fact, now we're talking about the age of big government. We've got pay-czars now. We've got government interference in all matters of the economy and the free markets. So from what I'm looking at, given the size of the government budget for not only the supplemental spending programs and stimulus for 2009, but the president's own budget for 2010. The way I look at it, government is getting bigger. So how do you stop this?
Well, we have two golden opportunities in 2010 and 2012. And I think that what you will see is a huge backlash against this overreach. Democrats will pay a price, the White House will pay a price, and I think that big government Republicans will pay a price as well. And one of the biggest misconceptions about the Tea Party movement, about these tax revolts, is somehow that they are merely partisan and anti-Obama, when there is as much ire and consternation over the Republicans who voted for monstrosities like the cap and tax bill, the huge national energy bill, and Republicans who blindly supported all of the TARP bailouts. It was clear that Hank Paulson was lying to the American public about the financial health of the banks that got all of the largesse. And I think that you will see a new breed of political activists, not just running for Congress and the Senate, but, it starts close to home in school boards and city council meetings. And what is wonderful to me and promising, encouraging, and it's great to end on a hopeful note here, I think, is that you're seeing ordinary people who had never been involved in politics before getting involved because nobody else is looking out for their kids. Somebody has to do it, and they are standing up and doing it for themselves. One
final question, if I may. One thing that we've seen over the last decade or two, it seems like the media, or at least what I call the mainstream media, has abrogated its responsibilities for investigative journalism. A lot of stories are buried, and I saw this in my own career where I actually did television news, where we would bury stories, we'd spike them, we would take sound bites out of context. Are we seeing the rise of new media? I mean, certainly when you see the New York Times stock selling at 55 cents, it tells you that something's changing in our culture and our business in terms of how news is reported, who gathers it, and who breaks the story.
Yes. I think it is quite exciting. I think the last barriers, the last vestiges of the old dinosaur mainstream monopoly have been completely removed. And remember that it wasn't Fox that broke the Acorn video sting. It was two kids who did not have advanced journalism degrees and had no mainstream outlet in which to publish their work. They published it on a new alternative media source, BigGovernment.com, which was founded by Andrew Breitbart, a big web entrepreneur. The blogosphere does a lot of its own investigative reporting that they will never get credit for because there is so much territorialism and competitive hostility by the old mainstream media. And they will have to change or die, speaking of change.
All right. Well, listen, Michelle, I want to thank you for joining us as my special guest on the Financial Sense Newshour. The name of the book is called Culture of Corruption by Michelle Malkin, currently on the New York Times bestseller list. And Michelle, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Oh, tell me why corrupted politicians, them a tell pure lies. Them a deep up the milk and what they picking they a cry. Them a that's where the hungry people, them a die. You know why? Come tell me why corrupted politicians, them a tell pure lies. Them a deep up the milk and what they picking they a cry. Them a that's where the hungry people, them a die. You know why?
Now comes my favorite part of the program, which is called the Q lines. We call them the Q lines, meaning the question lines. I guess you could call it comment, maybe QUOMMENT or something like that. Comment line as well. The toll-free number for the U.S. and Canada is 800-794-6480, 1-800-794-6480. That number does work from the rest of the world. but you have to pay whatever your international rates are. As we address your comments and questions, please remember the Financial Sense Newshour is for information and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell securities. Our responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of Jim Puplava and do not take into account listener suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. And as such, Financial Sense Newshour, because we're such nice guys, is not liable to any person for financial losses that result from investing in any companies profiled on the Financial Sense Newshour. Please remember to keep your comments to a minute. Otherwise, we don't get everybody in on the program.
Hi, Jim and John. This is Mike from Bridgewater, New Jersey. As always, I just want to commend you and compliment you on your show. It's absolutely great. I particularly enjoyed the deflation and inflation debate, and the reason is you always have a balanced view, particularly in this session. Your guests, you've made it a point to go out of your way to have both inflation and deflationary experts. I am now leaning towards deflation. I know you're more of an inflationist with all the government spending, but listening to some of these people like Prechter and Harry Dent, Gerald Celente, even Tim Wood, your regular, there's a puzzle being put together here, and they seem to have a pretty good handle on long-term trends. And I guess the question is going to come down to whether the government inflation is going to beat out all the deflation and deleveraging in the private sector. So anyway, I just wanted to say, great show. Please continue to do good work, and please continue to have guests that have knowledge and expertise in cycle management. That seems to be the key. I think when you add fundamentals with technicals and cycles, you have an ability to forecast the future as best as you can. Thanks again, and keep up the great work.
Mike, appreciate the comments, and we'll continue to have both sides of the debate. And as we did last week, for example, we had Robin Mills, who doesn't believe in peak oil, but at least you're going to get both sides of the story. Thanks for the comments.
Hi, guys. Great article in the Rolling Stone issue 1089 by Matt Taibbi. The article is Wall Street's Naked Swindle. It's about 6 pages long. It encompasses so much information about what you gentlemen have been talking about, the naked shorting and all the fraud that's been going on. If one just does a Google with Matt Taibbi, Wall Street's Naked Swindle, there's a video also on YouTube by Matt, and his name is spelled Taibbi. Anyway, I appreciate all you guys do for us, and I hope that people that listen to your program will look this article up because it blows the doors off this subject, opens it up for further investigation, hopefully some pressure on the SEC to make some dramatic changes in how it allows Wall Street to rip us off. Take care, guys.
I couldn't agree more. Matt Taibbi has done some great work, and he's also written some new articles on naked short selling. He seems to be the investigative journalist that is really sticking on this story. As I say, it's one of the biggest crimes of the century, and hopefully at some point the SEC will get away from its ties to Wall Street and actually protect the individual investor.
This is Dan in Missouri. I enjoy the debate regarding the inflation or the deflation. My question is, when will we know? Comments, Jim?
Dan, you're already starting to see that. I mean, if you take a look at macro analytics, Donald Luskin, the 3-month annual basis, the CPI is now increasing at an almost 5% rate. Also, if you take a look at the Economic Cycle Research Institute's U.S. future inflation gauge, that has been trending up. It rose to almost 91 in September, up from 89 in August. And so I think we're at the cusp of a cyclical upswing in inflation, and we should start to see that in the months ahead.
Hi, Jim and John. It's Donald here calling from the UK. I just listened to your interview with Rubbernil. You seem to glance over some key issues, and I thought on the whole his case is quite weak. However, he did make several good points, for instance, addressing Colin Campbell and suggesting that maybe political factors, social factors, technological factors, etc. could be instrumental in maybe higher production of late than maybe Colin Campbell suggested, and he was talking about certain oil fields. So, and he made some good points, but on the whole it's quite weak, and I do have to question the integrity of any scientist who believes climate change to be a key issue and carbon capture to be any important tool in controlling climate change, let alone anything else. what would be the chances of organizing a debate with, say, Rubbernil and Matt Simmons, or two others of similar caliber, similar to the recent debate you had with Miss Shedlock and Daniel Ammerman? Thanks for the show. Great work, guys.
You know, Donald, we've tried to have debates before. I wanted to get Matt to debate with the Sarah folks, and the Sarah folks didn't want to do it. They turned it down. The other problem that we have is, for example, a lot of our guests we get from overseas, and we just have a time factor. Matt's out of Houston, and Robin Mills would be out of the Middle East. So I don't know, there's probably a 12, 13-hour time difference, and that's one of the differences or difficulties in putting together these kind of debates. We're always up for ideas. We'll probably have a debate on peak oil in the future. It's just a matter of getting the right guest and also making sure the time differences work out for those participating.
Well, this is Chet from Philadelphia. I would like to thank you for a great program, especially the recent one on deflation and inflation. Just a couple comments. I was in the inflation camp previously, but listening to your program, I'm kind of shifting over to deflation. And actually, the clincher was Peter Schiff's argument that all these bubbles ended with the return to the gold standard. And I don't think that the United States will be in any position other than go back to gold standard. I don't think the Chinese or Japanese will accept anything else besides gold in the future, based upon our massive printing. Also, a couple other points that they made was that in the past year, worldwide prices have declined year over year. That's another factor that's kind of leaning me that way. And also, the rate of credit and the actual amount of credit is being destroyed faster than the Treasury can print the money. Those are my big factors of why I switched camps from inflation to deflation. Again, I'd like to thank you on a great program for discussing both sides of the issue. Great program. Thank you.
Jet, thanks for the comments.
Hi, Tim. I wanted to thank you guys for a wonderful show you put on. My name is Mark from Charlotte, North Carolina, and the debate on the inflation-deflation has been really great. But I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Everyone seems to be pointing to gold and oil and the dollar as a sign that inflation is moving, but gold is not anywhere near its inflation-adjusted high. I don't believe oil is either, and certainly the dollar is not near its all-time lows against the basket of currency. And the overall banking industry is so highly leveraged, I can't imagine them ever being able to continue to lend at anything near the rates that they did before. So overall, I think we're headed toward a deflation. But thank you very much for your program. I listen to it every week, and it greatly helps me. Thank you.
You know, Mark, two things I'd just point out there. If you have the government creating debt, okay, you can have the Fed that monetizes it. Another way is whether the Fed creates the money, it gets into the banking system, and then banks buy government debt. It's doing the same thing as the Fed. And remember also, if you take a look at how credit is created in this country, the banking system only accounts for maybe 25 to 26% of the total credit that's created.
Hey, Jim, this is Joseph from Philadelphia. Just got a quick question for you guys. You always mention a lot of books that are out of print, but one thing that you guys have not paid lip service to is Project Gutenberg at Gutenberg.org. They're a site that has about 30,000 books that are in the process of being digitized. For those of you who have such books like the Jendel Parsons book, The Dying of Money, can you guys actually look at this site and volunteer some time and start uploading them so that other people can start getting copies of it again? That way we can disseminate information better. Thanks, guys. Love your show. Take care.
Joseph, thanks for bringing that to our attention. As I mentioned, a couple of the books I think I mentioned last week, you can get free at vonmises.org. I know the Adam Ferguson book I think you can get, and I think the Bresciani Tironi, but we'll look into Gutenberg.
Hi, Dave from upstate New York. I'm really disappointed that you're having Michelle Malkin on your show, a right-wing extremist, and this is not a good thing for your excellent show.
You know, Dave, her book is on the New York Times best-selling list. One of the reasons it is, a lot of the things that she covers are not on the front page of the New York Times, whereas, let's say, anything done in a Republican administration is on the front page. And as we do on this program, whether it's inflation, deflation, peak oil, I mean, I've got a couple nasty grams last week that I had somebody like Robin Mills who doesn't believe in peak oil. We have both sides.
You know, Jim, I wanted to comment on this too, because what we have in America today, we've had a slippage in the quantity of people that have been trained in critical thinking in school or whatever. And if you've noticed over the last 10 years, we have terms that emerge, which we used to call in logic, if you remember, ad hominem attacks, which have nothing to do with the truth of an issue. To say that somebody is an extremist says absolutely nothing. The question is the person right or wrong on various issues, and can we prove that person right or wrong? A lot of the advances in science, for example, over the past 400 years, have been made by people who were extremists at the time. They didn't agree with the mainstream of what their scientific colleagues thought. And you see a whole bunch of words. You call a person a racist, you call them an extremist, you call them
right-wing.
Wingnut, a purveyor of hate speech. All of those things are nonsense statements, meaning nonsense. They say absolutely nothing. They do not address the issue. They simply raise the level of acrimony and contribute nothing to whatever debate should be there. And it is not an intelligent way of proceeding. But I do have to get amused at that. I figured out, by the way, what the definitions are of an enlightened person, a moderate, and an extremist. An enlightened person is when you agree with them. Okay. A moderate person is you don't agree with them, but you have the good sense to keep your mouth shut and not get in the way of their agenda. An extremist is a person who radically disagrees with you and says so and gets in the way. And so I figured that's how the definitions usually go. But anyway, those are classically what we know in logic as ad hominem attacks. They contribute nothing to the conversation. Truth is the issue. Is it true?
Dominic, Germany. Lower dollar, higher exports. Last week I have seen something in the supermarket. Carrots, washed, sliced, packed, ready to eat from the USA. I couldn't believe it. I mean, the carrots in the EU are dirt cheap. You can harvest them everywhere. It's not oranges from Florida, even in northern Finland. And I can't believe that's the kind of exports you're able to export. And it's only possible with cheap labor from illegal aliens, I think. And when the dollar goes further down, you can't even hire Mexicans. And with cheap energy, it's also possible to ship it. But with higher energy, I don't think so. I just wanted to tell you.
Oh, always interesting to hear comments.
Hi, this is Doug in Maryland. Hey, your inflation-deflation thing was really great. But I have a challenge for you. As I'm studying the markets, what the heck is happening in China and to a lesser extent India and Brazil is like the most important thing I can see. And although your show is great, you haven't had as much international coverage. So I'd challenge you to develop a set of experts who could come in and give us the BRIC report once a week, or have some other voices come in and pitch in at least once a month on what the heck is going on with China. Anyway, I hope this is a helpful suggestion.
Yeah, Doug, we did that just this week. There's going to be a half-an-hour discussion with Louis Vincent Gav, who's based out of Hong Kong and out of Asia, that follows the Asian markets rather closely, and we're going to be having more of those type of individuals on the program.
This is Andrew from Ashland, Wisconsin calling. Like many of your listeners, I've enjoyed listening to the inflation-deflation debates. One question I have for you, Jim, concerns the idea of a dollar devaluation. On several occasions, you've mentioned that President Obama's advisor, Christine Romer, has advocated for devaluing the dollar, similar to what FDR did during the Great Depression. I understand why FDR was able to devalue the dollar. Back then, the dollar was linked to gold. Mr. Prechter made a good point a few weeks ago when you asked him about the possibility of a dollar devaluation. He said that there is no way to formally devalue the dollar because it is no longer linked to gold. Jim, how would you formally devalue the dollar if its value floats, determined by the foreign exchange market? Would the government somehow intervene in the Forex market? Do you think the government would announce once that the value of the dollar, as measured by the dollar index, is to be set at a certain level? I fully believe the dollar is going to be devalued over time, but I think the markets will make that decision based on what the government actually does, not based on what the government says it wants the markets to do. Thank you for your time.
Andrew, another way that they can do that is, and this may come in the second crisis, but right now we're in a bull market phase for the markets as all of this money that's sloshing around drives markets up higher. But at some point, they're going to have to start taking away the punch bowl And I think it's going to be much more difficult for them. And if we can't get the economy going, if you listen to our discussion in the first hour on dollar devaluation, I think they're going to try for an orderly decline, much in the way that they did between 2001 and 2008. But if nothing works, they can simply overnight declare a new value for a currency. It doesn't have anything to do with the dollar, and a good example is follow what happened in Argentina, follow what happened in Mexico, and other currency devaluations around the globe. And as the dollar becomes less and less a store of value in a global currency, in other words, as other currency blocks begin functioning as reserve currencies, the European bloc, the Asian bloc, it'll be a lot easier for the U.S. to do so.
Jim and John, it's Peter from Toronto. The inflation debate format shows some of the best journalism I've ever witnessed. You guys are on the verge of becoming icons. I have an idea. Why don't you have more topics in this format in the future? You could have a Q-call segment that asks us what we think of each topic, kind of like a poll. To involve us even more, I believe the Hill could even attain even a wider following than you currently enjoy. Thank you, and P.S., I think inflation is the end result.
Peter, thank you for the suggestion. We're going to be taking on a much broader topic, much in the same way. But you know what? You guys can tell us if there's something you would like to see debated here. One of them that we've been thinking of is global warming. Is it man-made? Have we had global temperatures that have been warmer than where we are today? For example, in the 14th century when the temperatures were warmer. So we're thinking of also putting together a debate on global warming. That's something that we would like to do because it isn't really debated in the public arena. But we'd like to keep the show mainly on investment topics. The thing that fascinates me about global warming is, number one, the trends as in terms of how they impact this mid-decadal oscillator in the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific oscillator, how that changes weather patterns and how its impact on drought and food production. But that's something we'll tackle in the future.
Jim, it's Ed calling from Toronto. My question this week is that the inflationist, Peter Schiff, and I believe yourself, seem to believe that eventually the stock market may fall. Just about everything's going to fall, but precious metals will rise. It seems to me that precious metals and the stock market move in somewhat of a lockstep. So, and certainly that's the case up here in Canada. So if there's a belief that precious metals will rise when the stock market falls, that means at some point there has to be a decoupling between precious metals and the stock market. I mean, do you believe that's going to happen? What do you think is going to cause that? Do you have an idea as to when that might happen? Also, I have a bunch of money in precious metals, and I want to get it out by this February 2010. Do you have an idea as to what precious metals will do, especially silver, over the next 5 or 6 months? Thanks very much. Look forward to your answer.
Let me address your first question. There are periods of time when you see the metals market decouple from the regular stock market. The best example I can give you is the bottom in the metals market, which was reached in the spring, early summer of 2001, where you had the stock market continuing to go down for another 18 months, and yet the price of metals began to take off. So there was a decoupling there. The gold market preceded the run-up that we would see in all assets, so that was a turning point. In terms of where metals will be, we're in a very favorable period. I would suspect higher, and I'm just guessing here because we're in that seasonal pattern where metals do well probably into the spring or early spring or late spring, so I would expect metal prices to be higher.
Hi, Jim and John. My name's Marty, and from Woodstock, Maryland. Jim, it's been quite a while since we've had any update on the uranium industry, specifically with David Miller from Strathmore. I think it's time maybe we need to relook at that and just see how things are going on in that industry. David seems like he provides a great perspective. Thanks for your time, and thanks for all your work.
Marty, we're working on that.
Hi, Jim and John. This is Alex from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Thanks for the debate about inflation versus deflation. It's a real dichotomy, almost like the battle between the good and the dark side of the force. But what about hybrid ideas like stagflation, or as Shadow Stats is predicting, a hyperinflationary depression? These are some of the things that I'd like to hear your thoughts about in wrapping up the debate. Thanks so much.
You know, Alex, I think we're heading into a period of what I call stagflation, and depending on how the administration responds to that, we could end up in hyperinflation, because you've noticed in each business cycle, as we go through a boom and bust, the malinvestments that were created as a result of all the money printing and the fiscal stimulus, the malinvestments are never cleaned up in the economy. The economy is never allowed to heal. And every time we go through a crisis, they pour on more money. Just take a look at what we've done to get out of this one as compared to, let's say, what was briefly a minor recession in 2001. You saw massive money printing by the Fed. You saw Greenspan cut interest rates from 5.5% down to 1%. You saw government fiscal stimulus. We went from running surpluses to big deficits under Bush. And you compare that to the 91 recession. So every time we go through a period of time, we see even a more massive response, and that's one of the rules of inflation. You have to add even more stimulus, more money printing in each cycle. And one of the things that I would point out is one of the things that we saw so much stability in the 80s and 90s, and why we went a full decade in between a recession, is in the 80s we had expanding fiscal policy that was countered by conservative monetary policy under Volcker. In the 90s, we had expansionary monetary policy under Greenspan, with a conservative fiscal policy under Clinton and a Republican Congress. This decade, beginning with the Bush presidency, we've had expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, and that's being continued on steroids under Obama.
And just as an aside, Alex, in my opinion, the best Mexican restaurant in New Mexico is in Chimayo, just north of you, the Rancho de Chimayo. And great food, Jim, but your eyes will run, your nose will run. It's the hottest stuff you've ever eaten.
And by the way, we accept no money from that restaurant as an endorsement.
Right, that was not a commercial spot. That was a personal comment from having eaten there before.
This is Robert from Toronto, Canada. You mentioned in another broadcast that you may be packing up shop sometime in 2011 due to the worsening economical climate. What would be your opinion on my course of action? Before the end of 2010, I would like to wrap up all of my paper assets, examples of private pension fund, stock market portfolio, and convert these assets into gold or silver bullion, which would be entirely in my control, thus sidestepping a possible global bank failure or the perfect economical storm. These events could occur in 2011 or thereafter. Thank you very much for your time. Or as the gentleman in Buenos Aires says, hasta luego.
You know, Walter, the next cycle, and I think the deflationists are going to be amazed at the ability for the government to reflate once again. I mean, just look at the massive amounts of money that have gone into this reflation. We're talking trillions of dollars, and it's been global. I'm just looking at my Bloomberg screen and looking at double-digit money growth around the globe. And remember, there is a lag time between the time money is created until it works its way into the economy. But I think we're going to reflate again. Whether they can keep it going into the next presidential election, especially in 2012 being an election year before the crisis hits. But I think we will be in a crisis mode somewhere between 2011, 12, in that time frame. We're in a crisis mode right now, except for the financial crisis is stabilized. And now I think you're going to see the rise in commodity prices. And if you look at the back and forth that we've seen in this decade, you'd have a commodity crisis, rising commodity prices. Then we go back to a financial crisis. Then we'd have another financial crisis, and then you go back to another commodity crisis. And I think that's going to be the kind of roadmap of what we do in the future. And I think the responses that governments will take, and especially the U.S. government as it runs into its massive deficits into the next decade, will be in a crisis mode. And under those circumstances, bullion is going to do very well.
This is Jan from Waltham, Massachusetts, and I'm calling because a question that was brought up at last week's Q line talked about the dollar being a carry trade currency, and you disagreed with it. Jim Sinclair has written a couple of articles this week basically saying that the U.S. dollar is becoming a carry trade currency, and I'd like to understand why you believe it is not. Thank you.
I don't believe I said that the dollar is not a carry trade. It's got some of the lowest interest rates. No, I didn't say that I disagree that the dollar is not a carry trade. I talked about carry trades that have taken place around the globe, but I don't think I said the dollar is not a carry trade.
Jim, this is David in California. Hey, nobody can ever accuse you again of not giving people with opposing viewpoints or viewpoints different from your own a fair opportunity to be heard on the show. And now you've had Rubbernil on the show, who rather politely referred to you as a neo-Luddite. Great to have him on there, although it seemed to me that he had many factual inaccuracies in what he had to say and in his book. You are a subject matter expert on peak oil, having read dozens and dozens of books on the subject. Please go through point by point and highlight the factual inaccuracies that Rubbernil gave us. Those of us who are not experts really aren't in a position to evaluate what he was saying. I know you like to give deference to people who come on your show. I'm sure that encourages other additional authors to come on. But in this case, it just seemed to me that he was so off on the facts surrounding peak oil that you really need to weigh in and set the record straight. Thank you again. A great show as always.
David, we're going to be doing peak oil. In fact, we had a peak oil discussion this week with 5 experts on the program, and I'll be covering that issue next week in the big picture.
Hey, guys, this is Tom from sunny Tennessee. Enjoy your program. Quick question. If the United States government devaluated the dollar 15 or 20% overnight, over a weekend, what ramifications would we be looking for in gold and silver prices, bonds, stock prices, gasoline prices at the pump, groceries? Give us a broad view of what if that was done automatically overnight. Appreciate it. Be listening for the answer. Thank you.
You know, Tom, the first thing is gold would skyrocket. They devalued at that rate. I think that's what the gold market is doing now, just in response to what we've seen with a 6% decline in the dollar since the beginning of the year. 15 to 20% devaluation. You would see food prices go up, prices at the pump. Maybe not immediately, because it would depend on demand response to that. For example, if you just bought some inventory, you'd probably sell it at the current price or maybe even raise it gradually. But as costs work their way through the system, you would see those costs reflected in higher prices going up more than 15 or 20% because of all the things that are involved in the economy and as inflation worked its way through the system. Also, I think you'd see a nominal increase in the price of stock prices.
Oh, that's Jim and John. This is Richard calling from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Jim, it wasn't so long ago that you were saying that when gold was sustained over $1,000 an ounce, money would be pouring into the junior gold sector. Jim, will you go on record as saying that 2010 will be the year of the gold juniors? Que tenga buen día. Hasta luego.
You know, Richard, you can even say that of 2009. I'm looking at a screen of over 100 gold stocks right now, with some of these juniors up 200, 300%, 50%, 60%, 70%. You don't have to wait to 2010. It's happening in 2009.
Coming up in the next hour, we have the big picture, and Jim and John are going to talk about something that's missing. My notes, you took my notes again, Jim. Here it is, the dollar decline. Everyone's talking about whether or not the dollar is going to decline or not, so we'll see whether or not it declines precipitously, or if it's going to be a gentle, sloping, kindly slide. And we'll also have a roundtable today with 5 people on what? What's the subject?
We're going to be talking about peak oil. We're going to have the Logi investment management team. They've started a hedge fund called the Peak Oil Value Fund. And these are a lot of experts from supply side to hedging to trading to macroeconomics. And we're going to have them on as a discussion as we look at peak oil. And that's probably another topic I'll be covering next week.
All right, coming up next on the Financial Sense Newshour, and or next week at financialsense.com.